Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host, Nabeel Mahmood from Whitewell Lake.
This is your co-host, Phillip Koblence from Montclair, New Jersey.
And this is Richard Lukaj from Greenwich, Connecticut at the moment.
Rich, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. This has been way overdue. Lovely to have you out there. So let's get to know you a little bit. Could you share at a very high level with our audience, what do you do and who are you?
I do a lot of different things, but I guess my day job, I am a co-founder and senior managing director at Bank Street, which is a leading investment bank serving the technology, media, and telecom space globally.
Brilliant. So I've been reading a bit about you. Early life, you've got a very interesting childhood and upbringing. And from what I've been able to capture and get my arms around is that you grew up in a refugee camp. Could you share that journey?
I was born in a refugee camp. I didn't grow up there. At a relatively young age, my parents left that environment and came to the U.S. and I grew up in the urban New York City metro area. And through that time, experienced the life of an immigrant and the life of an inner city youth, if you will.
What brought your parents to the refugee camp? What is that story?
So there are different variances of refugee camps, but the thing that caused my parents to leave their homeland was seeking employment. They lived in an environment where employment wasn't possible for them due to discrimination and apartheid regime at the time in former Yugoslavia. And so thus they were denied education and then later employment as well. So the opportunities didn't look good for them. So they essentially sought opportunities to work elsewhere and support their siblings and family members back home, and moved to Italy, which was the nearby and receptive economy. And they were looking for cheap labor, and my mom and dad represented that. And Italy in those days had these, I'll call them work persons camps that people lived in, and they were allowed to leave the camp and go to work by day and come back and return and check in by night. So, in the absence of internet and cable TV, I was born. And I think that's where my humble beginnings began. But thankfully, my parents only lived there with me for about a year and a half or so, and then migrated to the U.S., who was one of those nations seeking more of that kind of labor as well. And they had largely two choices. It was America or Australia. And they both started with the letter A, and both seemed like very foreign places to them. But nobody offered them option B, so they chose one of the A's.
How old were you when you moved to America?
It's hard to know, but I think probably 18 months or 2 years or so. My parents don't have great records from those days, and I don't remember too well. So.
You weren't making memories back then? Incredible. Do you have any siblings? Were you the only child at that point?
I was the only at that point, but both of my siblings were born here in New York.
Amazing. You know what I gleaned from that is that Rich believes that if they had cable television or the internet, he wouldn't have been born. That was the one thing I got.
Or maybe that's what you're more like me ever born.
So how come they ended up picking, the Northeast? California back probably then was, relatively large and, happening place as well. So was there a reason? Were there friends, family that drove that migration or immigration to the New York region versus coming out west?
The refugees or employment migrants from Europe, in particular from Eastern Europe, they were all largely shuttled to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I mean, that was a natural pathway. They were intended to work in the factories on the west side of Manhattan. They were intended to be day laborers and cleaning crews and basically blue collar type of opportunities. And they were largely funneled pretty much directly. We weren't given a lot of choices. We didn't have friends and family or networks of people to direct us any better. So you pursued the path that was afforded to you because it also afforded to you available opportunity for employment. So, which was the principal reason that they left.
How much of early exposure did you have to education? I mean, I see that you ended up going to NYU and got a degree in finance and economics. Out of curiosity, what was the driving factor behind pursuing that versus what you were generally exposed to growing in the environment that you grew up in?
So very early on, we were all public school children. Obviously, we didn't have the means to consider any other alternatives, nor do I regret any of that. I also think, both of our parents who were denied the opportunity to get educated felt that was part of the reason to come here as well, was affording their children the chance to pursue the things they otherwise didn't have the ability to do. And so relatively early on, even though I don't think we had helicopter parents that were kind of overseeing our academic objectives, they put a value on the dream of an education in large measure that was present in our lives. And also, in some respects, they made it our own personal journeys. They did not view it as their burden to make sure that we did our homework or did the things that were necessary to succeed in education. So it became, for all three of us, I have a brother and a sister, relatively early on, a choice. And I found my academic pursuits in large measure kept opening up new horizons, new perspectives, new opportunities over time in a way that I knew of nothing else that could open up those kinds of pathways. And so in some ways, over time, I embraced my academic pursuits as the only way to break into new paradigms that I could not understand or appreciate from the surroundings that I was inheriting. I grew up in a very modest is probably the wrong word, but I would say it was violent, it was poor, it was not surrounded by necessarily the best examples or the high academic sphere of people as well. So academia was not a priority in the environment. And in some ways, I remember when I was going through middle school and beyond, you almost had to pretend like you didn't like education while still trying to do well at it.
Right. Yeah.
And, I would say it was.
And that was just to stay, that was basically just to stay safe. So you didn't get beaten up by those kids.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I was fully grown at 12. So I was in good shape, but
It's that European milk, man. It's incredible. It's incredible.
It's the real milk, Bill.
Right. That's amazing.
But nonetheless, as you know, even a big 12-year-old can invite others.
That's something
Exactly right.
I've learned. And did you feel a responsibility to and kind of help drive their pursuits, or was their experience significantly different than yours by virtue of you being the oldest?
The short answer is probably yes. I mean, it was a little bit of a dynamic where we're a close-knit family. We kind of relied on each other, maybe to an extreme degree, because it was some parts survival and some parts loving and wanting to be together. And when I think it was never a period of time where I don't remember being satisfied or happy, even though we were poor and in a pretty tough environment. But I think there were plenty of days with great stress and plenty of days that even included large doses of fear. So you are blessed in many respects to have people around you to be part of that journey together. So yeah, we had trials and tribulations, but I think in many cases it built a family of great resilience and in some respects, a optimism that had to overcome all of the drudgery that was around us on an average day. And those attributes, maybe among others, have helped us all excel in our lives. And my siblings are not only better looking, but more talented and touch many things around the world in their own rights. And as a family, we have, I'll call it, seen parts of the world and experienced things that our dreams couldn't even extend to as we were growing up. So
how could they be better looking? Come on. At an early age, like when did you realize, like you grow up in an environment and you don't know anything but that environment, at least initially, right? So when do you have the first memory of actually realizing that you guys were of, let's use your term of art, modest means?
So look, I think it's interesting. We've touched on two different concentric circles, right? So even though I lived in New York City, the number of times I left a like 10 or 15 block radius of my apartment were almost never. I mean, we didn't have mobility like we know it today. We didn't have means to even take trains and buses and do things that people take for granted today. The other reality was that we live in a concentric circle around other things that are happening even within our world that I had no contact. So I guess the first time I was conscious of that is one time my brother and I actually did take the train and we went to pick up our dad, who worked a night shift at that time. It was at Manufacturers Hanover Trust, and it was a big commercial bank in Manhattan. And he was the lobby porter and security guard in the building. So he worked a late shift, and we went to pick him up after work to escort him home because he had some concern about something that was going on there. And I remember we both walked into the lobby of this gigantic tall building, and we asked our dad, like, as some people were coming down the elevator and leaving, and I said, well, what are the people doing upstairs? Like, what do they do up there? And he's like, I don't know. Those people are the reason we all have jobs. And so it was that time that I realized that there are parallel universes that are coexisting with us that we had no peer into. And academia was the only path I saw to opening up my eyes and my perspective and perhaps my opportunity.
Is that one of the reasons why you actually ended up picking up finance and economics? Did you get you into the banking sector? I mean, from what I'm hearing right now is that there is that connection point, like visually you were there, you saw, you didn't know. And that probably created that level of interest to pursue that lifestyle or figure out how to get there.
Yeah, not much. I mean, I would say that I was too young still. While I was fully grown, I was intellectually not able to connect what was happening.
You didn't make all of your life decisions at the age of 12. Were you 12? Were you 12 when you picked up your dad
It's
at
hard to
that
know,
time?
but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
early double digits, I would call it.
Early
But,
double digits. So I think Nabeel tried to get you to thank Manufacturers Hanover Trust for giving you that love of finance.
But actually, for me, I didn't think finance at all. In fact, I used to look down on finance because I thought it was basically arithmetic, and it didn't seem very academically rigorous at all at the time. And so when I was in high school, I fell in love with engineering, actually, and more math, science, physics, things that also made sense to me. I probably was relatively uneducated in, I'll call it, the more liberal arts, and things that ended up, and maybe still am catching up with at later stages in my life where I didn't have the same weighting for them. But I was obsessed with engineering and creation. And, in high school, I worked on a Westinghouse project that produced a sensitized robotic arm. And I actually concluded most of my first couple of years of college education while I was in high school, and I took a fair amount of coursework at what used to be Brooklyn Polytechnic University in engineering related subjects and advanced math. And a lot of those credits ended up being attributed to my college time. And as a result, I was able to nearly complete my business school education while in undergrad as well. And so I was in a big hurry to go to an unclear path. But Nabeel, to your question about how did I end up in finance? I think it was largely due to a sort of catalyzing presentation I listened to one time, because I was clearly headed down the engineering path. And I happened to hear a speaker talk about the coalescence of finance and engineering as being something that my generation is going to see a lot more of. And I felt like I had been investing pretty heavily on more of my technical education, but hadn't really thought about finance or economics and things of that sort, and decided to put some weighting on that side of the equation. And I became a bit of a hybrid, I would say, somewhat of a technologist, but also with a finance pedigree. I also worked in a law firm for most of my college years, so had a little bit of a legal taste, if you will, as well. So putting all of those things together produced a candidate that, as I was graduating through college, had no idea what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. So I started a bit of a campaign to discover my next chapter. And I recall many of my interviews, my asking more questions of the interviewer than they were asking of me, because I was hungry to discover the next terrain, if you will.
And that was before people told you that that's what you should be doing to show interest.
Yeah, mine was an accidental path, and it didn't always result well, by the way.
Well, it didn't work. Curiosity did not work out well for the cat. So
Yeah,
I can see sometimes. Did your siblings follow similar paths in terms of their educational pursuits?
Somewhat, I guess I would say. My brother is the pride of the family because he's the lawyer. And, every family wanted a lawyer or a doctor, and I didn't achieve either. And my sister I guess she's a corporate executive. She runs a division of a very large Japanese company, and both are very accomplished people and people I love dearly.
Yeah. I could only imagine your parents thinking about Rich and being like, oh God, that Rich, he's really the runt of the family. He hasn't made anything of himself. If only he could have been a lawyer or a doctor.
Black sheep.
My God.
So at the age of 28, you became the youngest senior managing director in Bear Stearns history, if I read that correctly. What would you say are the key factors that contributed to your rapid ascent, and what challenges did you face during that period?
I think the ascent was due to the, we'll call it, concentration of many, many years of activities into a very short period of time. So I was able to essentially sacrifice all else and dedicate myself to my professional development in my 20s, and in a way that I'm not sure I recommend to anyone, but those sacrifices and commitments caused me to do more things in a compressed period of time.
And is that just a function of like hours a week working? Like you just worked all hours doing things, or was there more to it? No vacation days, things like that?
Well, it's all of those, but that is not sufficient, because results is what matters in this industry. And so you could put in the same hours, and if you don't have the same results, then it's not even noticed. So, we're in a very perfect competition ecosystem on Wall Street, particularly in the investment banking sphere. And so, some people think it's easy and lucky because they only see the good. the externalities, but reality is behind the scenes of any successes in this category is a lot of hard work and a lot of effort and tenacity and a good dose of good luck too, because not all of those things are interdependent or assured because one makes those commitments or sacrifices either.
So if during your Bear Stearns time, if you could think of like one or two like key pivotal moments that were like, holy crap, I can't believe I got that done. I can't believe that happened. Nobody else could do this but Rich putting his head down. Does anything like come to your mind?
Yeah, I don't think quite like that, but I have two pivotal moments. I remember one time I was probably in my early 20s and I was on my way to a board meeting and I rented a car and was heading to the hotel. The board meeting was the next morning. And I remember stopping at a red light and it was kind of one of these real cathartic moments where I was just like, I can't believe like I'm the guy going to this meeting to represent our firm to do anything.
I really got them all fooled.
It's not so much that I had anybody all fooled. I felt a sense of, I guess I'll call it monstrous levels of responsibility had been put on my shoulders. And on the other hand, an equally large dose of excitement about the prospect of being afforded the chance to do what I was doing. And so it was
A sense of accomplishment.
yeah. And oddly enough, there was a song at the time. It was something like, If My Friends Could See Me Now, that was kind of playing in the car. It was one of these weirdest alignment of moments.
But like, did you will that song to come on the radio, or did that song make you come up with that? You know, it's probably that.
That's what makes you a genius, bro.
I let the record show that Rich referred to me as a genius. All of you out there. What was the second?
You know, I think it was the song sort of elicited an emotion. Right. And for a second, and I was in a car, beautiful weather, top down, and waiting at a red light. And just for a moment, it was an appreciation of the graces that have been bestowed upon us.
It's amazing. And I think if we were going to write a script about Rich's movie, that is, I could see that scene. I could see it now. Together.
Absolutely.
Figure out what song that was. But so that was only number one. Yeah. What was the second?
So number two is probably another oddity story. And I won't name the names because they're dear friends of mine now. They're still around in the business. And so
I'm going to see if I can guess based on the description of the story.
But anyway, I was at this time, probably 4 or 5 years later, and a pretty accomplished person in what I was doing, but still not a brand name in the industry. And I was working on a transaction that involved as a counterparty, one of the largest companies in our industry and a very important client of mine across the table. And we get to this meeting and my team assembles and two very senior partners from another firm are advising this really large other company. And so I'm sitting, we look like we're ready to go. And the other guys are just still wandering around. And I'm asking like, are you guys waiting for somebody? And they were like, well, we're waiting for the rest of your team. And I said, we're here and fully assembled. And they were like, wait a minute, Bear Stearns thinks that this team is who should represent them and your client in this negotiation? I said, yes, that is exactly what they think because I'm speaking for them. There was another moment, but I had arrived at a place where I had the authority to actually make things happen. And we had an unbelievable run. Again, beyond dream experience at Bear Stearns, I did so many innovative and creative things with my colleagues and friends that I don't know, Phil, to your point, if they could have been done by others, if it was a matter of the chemistry that existed between my colleagues and partners and colleagues that made many of those things possible. But I was very grateful that all of those alignments did exist because they had afforded me the ability to participate in so many triumphant moments and innovations and creations of new securities. In many cases, availing the world of companies, technologies, capabilities that the world had never seen before. And it seems when I tell the story to my kids these days, it's a little bit of a fuddy-duddy thing. So I say things like, hey, I financed one of the earliest companies that provided email. They're like, oh God, that's so old and so perfect. All right.
I'm a huge proponent of like the concept that the magic of it all is not knowledge or even to a certain extent experience, but it's perspective. And I have to imagine that the perspective that you have from the upbringing, from the trials and tribulations you had earlier in life, coupled with, of course, you have to have some level of knowledge and know-how, but that seems commoditized. What you can't replicate is the perspective, that zeitgeist, that magic that you're bringing to those moments. And so I think that if I had to glean something from all of the successful folks that we've talked to, you probably on top of that list, It's all of those lived experiences brought you to this moment where the perspective that you're bringing to a situation and the confidence that that lived experience gives you in that moment is unteachable, right? It's yours and yours alone.
I'm not sure well, at least in my case, I'm not sure that exactly applied that way. I remember I was a 20-something-year-old that was finding himself in boardrooms and conference rooms with 60-some-odd-year-old average-aged board members. And I had no chance in that environment with I'll call it natural gifts. I had to absolutely know every detail. I had to be over-prepared. I had to be in a position where no one had thought about an angle or an idea that hadn't been covered, because any of those things would have buried me early on in my career. And by virtue of the fact that I was also often sticking my neck out, it afforded a great deal of risk to my professional well-being by virtue of doing that. And Bear Stearns was a very special place. They let you have all the string you can handle. In fact, they used to make the phrase that, hey, we'll let you have enough rope to hang yourself if you're willing to do it. But I think that created a dynamic where I defined a bit of a strategy for my success was going to be, I was not going to be outworked. I was not going to leave out a detail. I was not going to have any scenario where somebody with a better pedigree or better salesmanship or other variable was going to flank me, because I was going to be overweight preparedness. And it worked out pretty well for me. I think I earned the trust of people that I worked for and advocated for, and built my entire career on the back of mainly trust. And I think that trust is something you can't really do zeitgeist or gifting around. It's something that's earned with time. I think it's also tested frequently, because there are many times in the deal world opportunities where you might compromise your integrity or compromise a confidence, or, be opportunistic around something that might suit you, that might not be in the best interest of the company, or sell a product that your firm might want to sell that isn't exactly the highest and best alternative, because there are better alternatives elsewhere or externally. I was never willing to do those things. And thankfully, I had the flexibility by virtue of my relatively early success. I never needed to meet any such objectives. I was able to be a free agent, and I was able to also give advice that was not always oriented around the firm, because candidly, I was well exceeding any firm expectations of me. So I could provide a lot more flexible perspective, and in some cases, even introduced clients to my toughest competitors, because it was the right thing to do.
I think the most important, at least my takeaway from it, is like, you've got to be authentic. You've got to be yourself. We got to believe in yourself and be confident and comfortable in your skin. I mean, knowledge and hard work set aside. I mean, those are necessities. Those are areas of focus. That's a skill set that we must have. But if you don't believe in yourself, if you're not confident enough to sit in that boardroom and get your point across and be able to communicate, no matter all the hard work that you've done or effort that you've put into something, you can't really get it across the table. So it's not as useful as being able to communicate and believing in yourself would be.
I think that's an important part, but I guess I would also remind everyone that my investment banking professional role, it's not about me at all. I just have to believe in what I'm representing. I have to believe in the product, the capability, the management team, the opportunity. And if I do, it's more of an advocacy role. So I have to fight for them to extract the best opportunity for them. But also sometimes you also have to know, by virtue of having the market intel and exposure to the counterparty universe, you also have to know that information well enough to advise a company that, hey, you're overreaching. You're going to blow this up. You're not going to like where this is going to go from here, because there's something called the death spiral that is going to hit you. So for me, it was less about me. I was not intending to create I'll call it a brand for myself. I wanted to create a referenceable client experience. So for me, the thing I sought at the end of every client deal was a client that was going to tell 10 other people that, like, that was unbelievable. That was the best it can be. And I have worked with other investment banks, and this experience was quite different. And that's what motivated me. It was less about, hey, how great I personally was. And so that enabled us to start Bank Street and build our franchise here using many of the same practices, attributes, characteristics, and very proud of what we've been able to do here as well.
So you've got
just one point. You're in your 20s. You're in these boardrooms. You're talking about all of these complicated ideas. Do your parents have any idea what you do? I mean, at that point, I mean, what did they thought? I mean, is your dad still like the doorman as you come down from now these big buildings that you're working in?
Yeah. It was, well, I'll share a somewhat embarrassing story, but I had just become a partner at Bear. I guess it was kind of an anomaly on Wall Street. So I guess one of the industry magazines put me on the cover of the magazine, and my dad was riding on the train, and I guess somebody had tossed it on the seat, and he noticed that my picture was on it, and he thought I was in trouble. Like I had done something with.
There's a wanted poster. Seeing you on the back of a milk carton.
But that was one moment. And I guess we take for granted sometimes that, the parallel universes thing. My parents were still in a parallel universe, but didn't connect to my world reality. And so I invited them to my office, and it was another unforgettable experience because for them, as I said earlier, that they didn't often have experiences to leave the lobby. And so it was surreal. And it was for them also an important bridge to make sure that I wasn't some bad guy doing some bad things, because it didn't seem to them rational or logical that somebody in their 20s was doing as well as I was. And
especially that person being the black sheep of the family. I mean, my God.
that wasn't so bad.
Well, they got to be proud of you, though. I imagine that they would be really proud of you.
I think it's one of the most endearing attributes of them is that they don't really care very much about I'll call it our material accomplishments or even our professional accomplishments. Like even to this day, they're more focused on, hey, are you spending time at home? Are you making time for your kids? Are you doing things that are in your ability that don't relate to gain per se? So my dad used to always make this phrase about life is broken down into thirds. Your family is first, your professional pursuits are second, and then your community, the place you live, the friends and neighbors that are around you, and, family members who aren't as well off or doing as well need your hand and support. And that's an important third. Now, usually those things are prioritized that way because you inherit a family that in many cases is imperfect, and you have to learn how to love and live and coexist in a way that makes you useful in that sphere. And you do that through most of your childhood. And then in your professional endeavors, you are garnering the means to multiply and create your own family environment. And then beyond that, if you're blessed, which most people are, and his view was you didn't need to be able to name a museum or a library, but giving is everybody's responsibility. And so in his mind, he said, look, I'm a security guard in a commercial building, and I support two brothers and their children in another faraway place in the world. And so that's not to say if I can do it, you can do it, but everybody actually can do something. And figuring out what you're capable of doing and what you're willing to give and sacrifice is a very big part of living, I think, an enriched life. And I've tried to emulate that as best I can. And that's not to say that there's not always room for improvement and ways in which to keep thinking about how you can do all those thirds, if you will, better.
It's very touching. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons why we started the initiative and the journey that we are on. We'll get done just a bit. I'm just kind of curious, like what inspired you to start Backstreet, and how was that taken by your immediate family? I mean, you've got a healthy career. Why is this young lad going to start something from ground zero?
So they weren't back-to-back ideas. I had, as I said, a miraculous path while I was at Bear. And that chapter seemed to come to a recognition, if you will, that I had enjoyed the ascent more than I was enjoying presiding. And that was an important element of it. There were other, I'll call it Bear specific things that were going on that were going to require me to make some decisions about how I wanted to operate and be part of activities. And those didn't seem particularly interesting, despite the fact that I gave them a fair hearing. And as time went on, it became clear that it was time for me to do something else. I wasn't sure why I felt that way. I wasn't sure, again, that I had a clear path on what the next chapter would be, but decided to announce and part ways with my firm. It took me more than a year and a half to actually part ways, because when you're not leaving to go do something else, folks convince you to stick around and help bring something to conclusion and help transition something. And before I knew it, I was like, this is never going to end. So it's time to define a date. And we agreed on a date, and I left in the middle of 2002 and didn't really have a plan from there. We had a tragic sort of personal experience. My wife and I, we had a pregnancy where we had twins, and unfortunately one of the two did not survive. And it was a very difficult time to even imagine how I would have been working anywhere, to be honest. But a few months after that, it became time for me to shed some of the emotions and anger and feelings that the world isn't right or fair cleansing some of that and trying to put my head to more productive things. And that led to a variety of things. I was investing in companies. I was sitting on some boards at the time and starting to do some advisory for friends around the industry. And before I knew it, we were starting to do some things I really enjoyed again. And at that time, I met up with one of my former partners from Bear, James Henry. And I said to him, look, I don't know what's going to become of this, but I know we've had a great run before, and I'm interested in thinking big thoughts and attracting talent and seeing where it takes us. And we look forward now to this past year where we had over $30 billion of transactions concluded, and that rivals, the brand names that have been around for generations. And
I don't know how to break this to you. You are a brand name now. Made it. You've made it.
well, thank you for that. In any event, I think, from our vantage point, it's been an amazing experience. Our colleagues have been a blessing to work with. We obviously didn't start down this path with Nabeel, to your point, on a clarity of purpose. But as we got into the thick of things, a lot of the same attributes that built our brand name or franchise value, if you will, when we were at Bear Stearns, were the very same attributes we brought to bear on a new platform. And likewise, I think we've been fortunate to work with executives that have been at multiple companies and sit on multiple boards, and that network of experiences between us has afforded us more opportunities to prove ourselves. And we value so much the trust and opportunity that our clients have afforded us, because it's blessed our lives and enabled many of the great things that have happened for us.
Right. With this, can go on and on. I mean, I've got so many questions to ask. I mean, this could be like a 3-part series, or maybe even a movie for that matter. But just for the sake and for time, a couple of things, like based on what you know today and the experience that you've had thus far, is there one thing or two things that you would do differently? And if so, what would those be?
I'd say the one thing I would definitely do differently is would have weighted my time a bit differently. I would have put a higher weighting of my time on family during my 20s and 30s in particular, and regret sometimes that I didn't make those choices. And I missed a lot of birthdays and anniversaries and countless important moments. And I think, I'd give up a lot now to go back and revisit some of that.
Well, it's never too late, right? I mean,
as you can imagine,
right. Honey, we're going to have your 5th birthday again. I realize you're 23, but do you mind wearing this hat? I've rented out the McDonald's kids plate.
You've all been in that position. So.
Yeah, look, we live in a world that requires us. I think that the uniqueness of it is, as much as we talk about, nomadic and being able to work from anywhere, in many cases, showing up is 80% of it, right? And you have to make those choices, right? You have to travel somewhere, you have to be somewhere else than where you are. And there's never a good time. I hear constantly, no matter when the conference is, this is the worst possible time for it to be. Every time is the worst possible time to do anything. So life is unfortunately about choices, but I think the real important part is the self-awareness and understanding what's important. My question is, how many kids do you have?
2.
Have they expressed any interest in, other than thinking that email is a relic of the prehistoric era, have they expressed any interest in following a path in finance or technology or engineering or any of those things? Do they see what you do for a living and want that, or they want the polar opposite of whatever that is?
I don't know that it's the polar opposite. They don't seem to have much interest in my path, but I think
Grandma said you were the black sheep. She wants a doctor.
But my wife and I have taken the philosophy of supporting their dreams and personal ambitions. And, those have varied for each of them at different times. They've had different dreams and pursuits, and they're both extremely talented and have their own gifts. And I think, Nabeel, I think you said something at the outset about, when we start down these paths, we really never know what it forms into. But I think both of them have gigantic hearts, and they are both justice warriors in their own way. They both have great aspirations and expectations of the world, and I think their mother's done a great job with them.
What's your one, like we all have children here, what's your one message to your kids? Forget and put aside being in the technology sector or being in finance or whatever the case might be. What's that one thing, that one reminder that you, or then takeaway that you took away from your parents and your upbringing that you want to pass it on?
I think the number one thing would be to trust and love your family. They may not seem perfect at all times. They may not always seem like they understand your world or that you're even living in the same world, but the circle of life actually will help reveal things. I often kid about this, but when I was a teenager, I thought my dad was a fool. But as life has gone on, I think he's brilliant. So, sometimes it takes time to understand and to appreciate things, but I think your family unit is so utterly important and in ways that no one can surmise at a moment in time. And I would also say that when people think about complaining about life or issues in life, I would often say, start with concentric circles around the things you control. It's easy to blame things on the president or national leader type, but if you're troubled by the garbage, focus on your property, focus on your neighbor's property, focus on your community. Before you know it, you're an example. And before you know it, your community is the place that people prize to be in. And behaviors change, environments change, and worlds around you change. And so, I guess I'm not a therapist or a person who gives, I do speak to a lot of young people. I do enjoy, and they sometimes revitalize me, right, with their ambitions and sometimes blind ambitions. But I think opportunities like what you all are affording for people to maybe see their younger selves, and also for young people to maybe connect with messages of older buddies like myself that may seem foreign or just as unapproachable as the non-lobby floors as that were for my family, that there's a human element that they remember. And as they're graduating from college, maybe they see a guy like me and say, hey, this guy had no idea what he wanted to do after college. And despite being a strong academic and clearly an accomplished student, not a clue as to what the next chapter would hold as I was starting my interviewing cycle. So, and by the way, I picked banking largely because it was an opportunity to work with a large and wide variety of companies in the hope that one day I grow up and join a real company. And so I didn't think actually it was a real job to advise people.
Oh, this is brilliant.
If it's not a real job, then you've done the fake job really, really well.
Really, really brilliant. Well, Rich, we're going to have you come back on the podcast again. I certainly believe there's a second part to this. Want to learn a little bit more about you. The key takeaway from the last comment that you made is, or at least for me, if you want to make the change, be the change. With that, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to catching up with you at PTC in Hawaii.
Same here. I look forward to it.
Thanks so much, Rich.
Thank you.